Hello, everybody. Welcome to this lecture. I think Peter Ray is going to put us all on mute, apart from me and Karen, hopefully. And I'm Deirdre Bauer-Latz. I'm the principal of Nazarene Theological College, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's lecture. It won't be a very fulsome introduction. If we were all in person, it would be much more grandiose. But suffice it to say that you're more than welcome as you join us for this Manchester Wesley Research Centre lecture. It's the 16th annual lecture, and these lectures are not only offering excellence in calibre and provocation, enabling us to be good practitioners and people in the Wesleyan studies arena, but it brings us together from around the world. The Manchester Wesley Research Centre has 16 global partners, and if you're interested in learning more about them, you can see them on the website. But in particular, the International Board of Education sponsors this lecture, and so we're very grateful to them for all of their endeavours in enabling this to happen. Our lecture today is given by Professor Karen Westerfield Tucker. She's a United Methodist elder with extensive experience teaching, leading, and developing courses around the world. Her research interests include North American liturgical history and theology, Methodist, Wesleyan liturgical history and theology, liturgy and pastoral care, ecumenism, and hymnody. And since 2006, she's been a member of the Joint Commission for Dialogue in the Methodist, the World Methodist Council, and the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. She's also currently a member of the Hymnal Revision Committee of the United Methodist Church. We're so sorry that she can't be in Manchester in person, nor we with her, but we are absolutely delighted that she is nevertheless able to give us this lecture. And the topic that we're about to plunge into together is another look at the Methodist Wesleyan Love Feast, reception, adaptation, and emerging possibilities. In this examination of the Love Feast in the global Wesleyan tradition, focus is placed on reception, adaptation, and reinterpretation from the 19th century to the present. Attention is then given to what a love feast or an adaptation might offer to Methodists and Wesleyans in the 21st century context. After this lecture, we're going to take questions, which I will moderate, but in the meantime, let's turn our attention to Professor Westerfield Tucker. So, Karen, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I would like to thank Jordan Hammond and the board of the Manchester Wesley Research Centre for this opportunity to give the Centre's 2020 annual lecture. Of course, when I accepted this invitation roughly 2 years ago, we had no idea that I would not be physically present with you for this address. We also could not have foreseen a situation where library access for research would have been very limited or non-existent. So in some respects, this is not the paper I originally imagined. However, the unexpected circumstances also presented a new opportunity. The stay-at-home measures that were introduced as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the related need to close houses of worship caused some Methodists and Wesleyans, and others as well, to take a look again at the subject of this presentation. Thus, my topic of the Methodist Wesleyan Love Feast, chosen long before the novel coronavirus was a concern outside of China, has turned out to have particular relevance for Christian communities today. Two months ago, I received an email from a former student, now a United Methodist pastor. She was planning the congregation's upcoming Maundy Thursday service, which, because of COVID restrictions in her state, would occur online. The congregation had a tradition of Holy Communion for Maundy Thursday, but she did not consider this an option under the circumstances for theological, liturgical, and pastoral reasons. Would a love feast, she asked, be a suitable substitute? She knew that historically testimonies were an important part of the love feast. Could she forego that component as well as singing in favor of only prayer, the attendees eating in their respective places, and a simple sharing of joys, sorrows, and frustrations, and still call the practice a love feast? Could she claim this adjusted practice to be a part of the Wesleyan tradition? The term Wesleyan tradition is manifestly ambiguous. Is the emphasis on Wesleyan or tradition? Does it reference the thinking and actions of the brothers Wesley, that of their spiritual descendants, or both? What if there are strong differences or distinctions even within those categories? Can the container of Wesleyan tradition hold them all? John and Charles had disagreements on important matters related to the Methodist movement. Today, there are churches claiming a connection to John Wesley that only baptize persons who can publicly profess their faith. Other such Wesleyan churches practice both believer and infant baptism. Still others do not practice baptism at all, as in the case of the Salvation Army. Within my own United Methodist Church, persons hold vastly different views about the denomination's future, yet each claims their perspective to be decidedly Wesleyan. My intention here is not to explore this matter of the Wesleyan tradition fully, but only as it pertains to our subject of the love feast. As we shall see, by taking a longitudinal view, the flexible and multivalent love feast comprise numerous purposes and practices in different times and contexts. In some sense, this corresponds well to the conclusion of certain recent scholars regarding the early Christian agape, the stated source of inspiration for Methodist and Wesleyan love feasts. There has been a tendency for scholars of the past and present, presumptively, to look for or devise a singular form and practice for the agape, based on the meager and diverse data presented in Scripture and early Christian texts. However, these recent scholars read the diverse evidence as demonstrating that the ancient agape, while generally having connections with the observance of the Eucharist, was characterized rather by regional and local diversities in thought, purpose, and practice. The Methodist successor of the agape also demonstrates multivalence and local variety after John Wesley's introduction of the practice to the people called Methodists. Roughly a decade after encountering the Moravian practice of the love feast in the American colony of Georgia, and his sharing in the first love feast at the Federline Society in London, John Wesley gave in 1748 a plain account of what had by then become a familiar Methodist practice. While not a thick or fully complete description, this account does highlight several of the key reasons and purposes why Wesley advocated the love feast for the early Methodist movement. In order to increase in them a grateful sense of all his mercies, I desired that one evening in a quarter, all the men in band, on a second, all the women would meet, and on a third, both men and women together, that we might eat bread, as the ancient Christians did, with gladness and singleness of heart. At these love feasts, so we termed them, retaining the name as well as the thing, which was in use from the beginning. Our food is only a little plain cake with water. But we seldom return from them without having been fed, not only with the meat which perisheth, but that which endureth to everlasting life. Great and many are the advantages which have ever since flowed from this closer union of the believers with one another. They prayed for one another, that they might be healed of the faults they had confessed, and it was so. The chains were broken, the bands were burst in sunder, and sin had no more dominion over them. Many were delivered from the temptations out of which till then they found no way of escape. They were built up in our most holy faith. They rejoiced in the Lord more abundantly. They were strengthened in love, and more effectually provoked to abound in every good work. Let us look at these reasons and purposes in the context of 18th century British Methodism. An imitation and perpetuation of apostolic practice. Wesley, who looked to the early church as the model of the true Christian faith, made clear in his plain account that he intentionally borrowed what he understood to be the love feast from the ancient Christians. His reference to eating bread infers the practice described in Acts chapter 2, verse 46, though in his comments on this text and his explanatory notes on the New Testament, Wesley identifies the breaking of bread as Eucharistic and not part of the agape meal. Wesley's acquaintance with some of the limited evidence of the agape from patristic sources or from secondary sources from secondary accounts of early Christianity predated his encounter with the Moravians and their love feast. He notes in his diary in 1732 that he read the so-called apostolic constitutions attributed by some 17th and 18th scholars to the first century Clement of Rome, who died in 99, which in Book 2 contains a limited reference to an agape. Early in his ministry, Wesley regarded apostolic constitutions as truly apostolic, an assessment he shared with the Manchester nonjuror Thomas Deacon, with whom he had an acquaintance. Deacon in 1734 developed a complete collection of devotions inspired by apostolic constitutions, and included in an appendix Wesley's essay on the stationary fasts. However, a scheme for the practice of a love feast does not appear in complete collection of devotions, likely because of the book's reliance upon the liturgical shape and content of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. Deacon does speak at length about the apostolic agape in language remarkably consonant with Methodist love feast praxis in his book, A Full, True, and Comprehensive View of Christianity, published in 1747, though by that point, Wesley and Deacon had parted ways. After an historical summary, Deacon summarized, from whence it appears that these love feasts were a rite which accompanied the Eucharist, and that as they were designed for the promotion of unity and charity, they were commonly held in the church for more than the first 3 centuries and a half. Indeed, this custom was not only of apostolical original, but was likewise of so great service to the Christian church. It is therefore an useful and laudable rite, and as it is a feast in common, all outward distinctions must be banished from it, and the rich must put themselves entirely upon a level with the poor. In a word, charity must be the foundation of this holy banquet. Prayer must begin and end the feast, Singing of hymns and religious discourses must season the entertainment, and modesty and temperance run through the whole. In addition to apostolic constitutions, Wesley noted in his diary for 1732 that he also read William Cave's Primitive Christianity, a text that he would later extract for inclusion in the Christian library intended for Methodist readership. Cave characterized the agape as rich and poor eating at the same table, where, quote, they testified and confirmed their mutual love and kindness, unquote. An interpretation likely influenced Wesley's emphasis upon testimony in the Methodist version of the praxis. Wesley's reading of early Christian sources continued while in the American colonies, and on that list was French Bishop Claude Fleury's Bourg des Israélites et des Chrétiens, which Wesley would translate, abridge, and eventually publish in 1749 as The Manners of the Ancient Christians. Wesley's abridgment includes a full section on a post-Eucharistic agape in the chapter on the Church of Jerusalem, which idealized that, quote, all the Christians were as little children in humility, disinterestedness, and purity. By renouncing worldly goods and hopes, they cut off the occasions of passions and of the uneasiness of life, so that their minds were wholly taken up with heaven and their hope full of immortality. Wesley's translation is close to the French, though his words, hopeful of immortality, give a theological gloss to Fleury's actual statement about the early Christians anticipating the coming reign of Christ. Nevertheless, both the French and the English speak to an eschatological orientation of the early agape. This emphasis Wesley translated to the Methodist gatherings, with the intention that attendees would experience a foretaste of the oneness with Christ and each other that they would know fully upon Christ's return. Wesley's readings of the early church likely piqued his interest in the ancient agape, but it was his experience of the Moravian Love Feast on August 8, 1737, that awakened for him its pastoral and practical possibilities. It is significant that on that occasion, Wesley recorded in his journal that the practice measured up to his view of a primitive Christian standard. He said that it was celebrated in so decent a manner as a Christian of the apostolic age would have allowed to be worthy of Christ. A year later, the Love Feast was a regular and expected component of Methodist worship and spiritual life. A regular and regulated experiential event. Wesley stated his key for the regular practice of the Love Feast in the plain account, that one evening and a quarter, all the men in band, on a second, all the women would meet, and on a third, both men and women together. The bands, an organizational unit that Wesley borrowed from the Moravians, were the smallest and most intimate of Wesley's groups, with 5 to 7 members, typically divided according to gender and marital status. The small group format not only allowed for intimacy in the revelation of personal dispositions during the Love Feast, it also permitted some control of behaviors when emotions swelled in the expression of desire or gratitude for God's mercies. The provision of a separate Love Feast for women allowed them the opportunity to participate freely to counteract the constraints imposed by English society. Eventually, the larger units of Methodist organization, the classes and the societies, held Love Feasts, with attendance typically restricted to those in good standing within those units. Persons not members of the Methodist societies might attend with special permission if judged earnest in their request. Authentication of a person's status by a doorkeeper came by the presentation of a ticket or token, updated quarterly, which bore the name of the individual as well as the authorizing person. This was the common plan, to which there were exceptions, as noted by Wesley and others. With one gender segregated and one combined meeting each quarter, the qualified and predisposed could attend a love feast 8 times a year within the larger societies. As the Methodist movement expanded and its organization developed, at least 4 of the love feasts fell at the regular quarterly gatherings. There were both administrative and spiritual occasions. Sundays following the evening worship service was the usual time for the love feast, though it was held on weekdays as well. Sometimes the scheduled love feast coincided with special days in the Christian calendar. The records of diaries and journals indicate love feasts held on Christmas Day, Good Friday, Easter Eve and Easter Day, and Pentecost or Whit Sunday, but apparently not on Maundy Thursday. Occasionally, society leaders intentionally planned love feasts to fall on Christian festal days, notably Christmas Day, either by adjusting the regular schedule or by providing an additional event. Love feasts also very quickly attached to gatherings of Wesley's preachers, and particularly at the conference meetings. Moments in the construction of a new chapel, such as the laying of the cornerstone and the opening of the house, might see the inclusion of a love feast. The regulation of individual love feasts was a delicate balance between overly long sessions of 3 to 4 hours, or more in some cases, and brief gatherings of less than an hour that limited participation. The ideal, which the Conference of Preachers with Wesley eventually regulated in 1765, was an hour and a half. Christian affection, the love feast. Other regulations connected to the event as a love feast, an identifier Wesley chose to retain because of its antiquity. He was well aware from his reading of Cave and others that in the early church, the name alone could arouse suspicions that the participants were engaging in inappropriate, even immoral behaviors at the evening gatherings. For this reason, Wesley limited the oversight of the love feast to the assistants and superintendents who reported directly to him. And the Conference of 1765 stipulated that love feasts should conclude early enough for participants to be home by 9 p.m. Even with such precautions, accusations of sexual promiscuity proliferated in anti-Methodist publications, in poetry, in prose, in graphic images, such as this one here, where you see the food from the love feast on the floor and the Methodist preacher hiding under the table. The singing of hymns, a customary practice at love feasts, was also subject to ridicule in this anti-Methodist literature, among other things scrutinized for its intention to engage the passions. In 1801, one Robert Fellows insisted, quote, "In the agape of the fanatics, the Methodists, desire is often indulged without restraint, because it is thought to contribute to the perfecting of the saints in love," unquote. A Methodist respondent challenged Mr. Fellows' indecent reflection and suggested calmly that he needed to be more acquainted with his subject. Wesley intended love feasts as occasions for the expression of love for God and neighbor, and in this sense, to be an intensification of the purpose of the Methodist society found in the general rules: to pray together, to receive the word of exhortation, and to watch over one another in love, that they may help each other to work out their salvation. This spirit of charity also carried with it another dimension, that of care for the poor by those of means, an emphasis surprisingly absent from Wesley's plain account. Thomas Deacon and other early church commentators regarded benevolence as a principal purpose of the apostolic love feasts, as signaled by certain patristic writers and by St. Paul's critique of the Corinthian agape meal practice. Participants at the Methodist love feast made a collection of money, and after the payment of expenses related to the love feast itself, the remainder normally shared among the poorer members of the society. In some cases, the money went to the itinerant preachers or to support the upkeep of the local society, which caused the Conference of 1789 to enforce that the money collected at the love feast shall most conscientiously be given to the poor. The collection of money for the poor at the love feast also, intentionally or not, served as the Methodist near equivalent of the collection of alms made during the Church of England's official liturgy for Holy Communion. The shared action of giving to the poor in those different contexts owes to the tight connection between agape and Eucharist in some patristic reports, a linkage at a singular event that over time was broken in favor of an evening agape and a morning Eucharist. Thus, love feast and Lord's Supper both historically carry a connection with benevolence for the poor. For some Methodists, the love feast collection of money had overtones with the Anglican parish's Holy Communion, which may have aided a perception of the love feast as having a quasi-sacramental quality. A common meal. Of course, the stronger Eucharistic association was in the use of food and drink. Instead of a full meal, which defined the agape in certain places in the early church, Wesley states in plain account that the love feast used only a little plain cake and water, which also served to distance the love feast from the Lord's Supper. Water, or sometimes tea, passed from person to person by means of a mug, or a two-handled or three-handled loving cup. Plain cake broadly meant a baked wheat product, as Methodists utilized biscuits, buns, bread, and seed bread, often specially baked for the occasion. A method of sharing bread came under scrutiny because of a practice introduced by James Wheatley, an itinerant preacher who the Methodists in 1751 formally expelled based on evidence of immorality. The Conference of 1765 forbade Wheatley's silly custom, which Joseph Nightingale described in detail. The stewards hand to all present a little plain or spiced bread and water. It was originally the practice literally to break bread with each other, but much confusion and disturbance throughout the whole assembly being thereby occasioned. That practice is now prohibitive by positive command of conference. It would very often happen that a person might have a particular attachment to some brother or sister who might be seated several pews distant. And when an attempt was made to manifest this attachment by breaking bread with a favorite, the noise and trouble of scrambling over the backs of the seats or of pressing through the aisle not only retarded the most important business of the love feast, but gave considerable offense to those who had either more modesty or less violent and impatient prepossessions. Did some Methodists see the love feast as a substitute for the Lord's Supper? given that numerous parish churches often did not welcome Methodist attendance at worship? Yes, but that was not Wesley's intention. Wesley's reference to John 27 in plain account that, quote, "We seldom return from them, the love feasts, without being fed, not only with the meat which perisheth, but which endureth to everlasting light," unquote, certainly has strong Eucharistic resonances, though it is not a text actually quoted in the prayer book's Lord's Supper liturgy. The spiritual experience of the love feast clearly was akin to what was hoped for at the sacrament in terms of a fresh experience of the presence of the triune God and a communion with the saints below, if not also with the saints above. Thus Charles Wesley's hymn entitled The Love Feast. Come, thou high and lofty Lord, lowly, meek, incarnate Word. Humbly stoop to earth again, come and visit abject man. Jesu, dear expected guest, thou art bidden to the feast. For thyself our hearts prepare, come and sit and banquet there. Jesu, we the promise claim, we are met in thy great name. In the midst do thou appear, manifest thy presence here. Sanctify us, Lord, and bless. Breathe thy spirit, give thy peace. Thyself, thou thyself within us move. Make our feast a feast of love. The love feast, of course, lacked the formal structures and clericalism of the sacramental rite, which may have enabled participants to experience newfound spiritual freedom and liberty, as well as emotional release. Yet similar to the sacrament of the supper, the love feast was oriented toward salvation in Christ. Again, Charles Wesley's hymn. Make us all in thee complete. Make us all for glory meet, meet to appear before thy sight, partners with the saints of light. So one of the characteristics that Wesley describes in the plain account is of the love feast as an opportunity for sharing of prayer, for confession and forgiveness. The Methodist love feast was an occasion for extended prayer, which also included the confession of sin and the assurance of Christ's forgiveness. Wesley's plain account summarizes this practice, and though he does not specifically reference James 5:16, confess your faults one to another and pray for one another that ye may be healed, that scriptural basis for the practice of confessing to another or in a small group is very clear. In this sense, all Christians, as members of the priesthood of all believers, were to encourage others to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ in order to receive salvation. Acts 16:31. This practice of confessing to one another in the love feast and other settings drew criticism from Methodism's detractors, who suspected the Methodists of silent collaboration or manifest fondness for Roman Catholics, an accusation that Wesley and other Methodists firmly repudiated. The love feast as an occasion for confession also offered the opportunity for reconciliation in the case of disputes. An early example was a love feast arranged with the intention to settle differences between the Moravians and Methodists at the Fetter Lane Society in London that had resulted in the departure of the Methodists. Scheduled 3 years to the day from the first Methodist Moravian love feast at Fetter Lane, the occasion was attended by 7, including John Wesley. But the breach would not be healed, as we well know. But I might add, until the establishment of a full communion agreement in 2018 between the Northern Province of the Moravian Church in North America and the United Methodist Church. The love feast as a prudential means of grace. According to the plain account, The expected fruits of the love feast were an increase in gratitude for God's mercies, a building up of faith, and a strengthening in love, all of which were to issue forth in the Christian virtue of every good work. In other words, the love feast was a setting intended to foster works of piety and nurture works of mercy, all in response to the experience of the love of God. Prayer of various types assisted in the acquisition of these fruits, but an extended time of testimony proved the most beneficial and thereby became the central component of the love feast. Wesley reports in his journal for Sunday, March 15, 1761, an observation that he repeated widely elsewhere. At the love feast in the evening, many, both men and women, spoke their experience in a manner which affected all that heard. These were old and young, educated and illiterate, wealthy and poor, all testifying to their encounter with the living God and sharing in the struggle to know full assurance of faith. These could be powerful occasions. They also could be dead and lifeless. These were occasions where God's grace was always outpoured upon the receptive heart. Although never specified as such, the love feast functioned as a prudential means of grace. It was not a practice ordained by Christ, therefore not an instituted means of grace, but rather initiated and deemed effective by the people of God for a particular time and place, and recognized as a conduit of God's love. Wesley and the early Methodists never formulated a stipulated text or any text for carrying out the love feast. Yet the practice had a customary, flexible shape. Methodist scholar Frank Baker harvested the evidence in 18th century diaries and journals to propose a general structure. Hymn, prayer, a sung grace, the distribution of bread and cup separated by a collection for the poor, an address by a presiding minister, testimonies, singing, prayers and singing, a closing exhortation with a hymn, and a benediction. We move now to make a very brief look, at 19th century British Methodism. In 1828, Hugh Bourne of the Primitive Methodists, founded in 1807, included instructions for their love feast in a general hymn book, which outlined a shape similar to what Baker constructed. Bourne made clear in his instructions the need for decorum in the emotionally heightened and confessional love feasts, which suggests that problematic behaviors were regular occurrences. He also identified two specific purposes of the love feast. Bourne wrote, "Love feasts usually open with singing and prayer. A piece is then sung by way of asking a blessing, after which bread and water are served out. The love feast collection is made, and a piece sung by way of returning thanks. The preacher makes a few remarks. The people rise in succession and speak their own experiences. And distant comers sometimes say a little about the work of God in other places. But none are allowed to run into useless exhortations, drag out to tedious lengths, or to speak unprofitably of others. And above all, not to reflect upon or find fault, either with individuals or societies. And it is the preacher's painful duty to stop all who attempt to trespass. He has to preserve the love feast in its clear and pure course, in order that people may grow in faith, and that the Holy Ghost descend. In order that the people may grow in faith, and that the Holy Ghost descend." Singing and prayer are occasionally introduced, and, says Bourne, the love feast finally closes with prayer. The primitive Methodists were not the only branch within British Methodism to embrace the use of the love feast, for all the groups retained the love feast among their practices. However, the primitive Methodists were particularly keen to use it because of its evangelistic capacities, and especially in the context of camp meetings, which they eagerly adopted, whereas the other branches were more hesitant to do so. Many of the primitive Methodist leaders knew the spiritual power of the love feast firsthand because it was there they themselves had been converted. For all the branches throughout the first part of the 19th century, the love feast remained a quarterly or at least an annual event and was a valued occasion for worship and communion with God and neighbor. The quasi-sacramental status with which Methodists held the love feast drew the attention of critics outside of the Methodist and Wesleyan fold. For many Wesleyans, wrote Edward Pusey in the 1830s, means of grace signifies not the Holy Eucharist, but their own peculiar discipline, their class meetings or their love feasts. They have often lost even the abstract belief that the Holy Communion is any way more solemn or intended with more mysterious blessing. Pusey's words actually anticipate shifts already underway in the practice of the love feast. Some components, such as the sharing of food and the collection for the poor, gradually fell away, leaving the event principally a time of prayer, song, testimony, and confession. As the Methodist and Wesleyan branches continued transitioning from society to church, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, and because for many, Christian nurture and formation supplanted the expectation of an emotional conversion, the love feast overall lost most of its appeal. Love feasts might be held annually at camp meetings, with a stress on evangelical witness, or at meetings of conference, with a stress on fellowship and unity in Christ. Some communities did not hold them at all. The Lord's Supper became the principal means of communion and fellowship. Thus, the love feast, as a prudential means of grace, it seems, had served its time in Britain. The reception and adaptation in the United States, 1770 to 1939. The love feast came to the American colonies with Methodist immigrants in the 1760s, though it is only in the year 1770 that there is a concrete record of a love feast. Actually, two, both held that year. The first in Philadelphia and the second in New York, both led by Wesley's appointee, Joseph Pilmore. There is much more evidence thereafter as the number of Methodists, Methodist societies, and love feasts swelled. Journal and diary entries from the Methodist preachers and from ordinary Methodists and others frequently testify to the presence and power of God at these feasts of love. By 1771, love feasts were attaching to the quarterly meeting that initially spanned over several weekdays, but which soon took up a 2-day format on the weekend. In the weekend format, the love feast typically took place on Sunday at 9 a.m., followed by preaching. After the creation of the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1784, and with it the ordination of presbyters or elders with sacramental authority, the supper typically followed Sunday preaching, thereby creating the pattern of love feast, preaching, and sacrament. To accommodate this practice, the collection for the poor, which in the British scheme came between the distribution of bread and water, relocated to after the testimonies and toward the conclusion. Although a preacher had the authority to lead love feasts, in the context of the quarterly meeting, the duties often fell to the visiting presiding elder, the regional leader, who would preside at both love feast and sacrament, thereby restoring, albeit likely unintentionally, the primitive Christian form. The rules, both legislated and customary, that applied to love feasts in Britain were imported and accepted in the colonies. Thus, there was the expectation of no more than 1.5 hours of duration and the need for a ticket for admission. Both of these rules were often violated, the first by the overwhelming enthusiasm generated during the meetings, and the second by persons insistent upon joining the experience for the salvation of their souls. To assist in the regulation of admission, legislation in 1773 decreed that a properly vetted person might attend the love feast 2 to 3 times, but thereafter would need to take membership, this to preserve the capacity for participants to speak freely. This rule remained in the discipline of several American Methodist branches until late in the 19th century, though evidence is that it was unevenly enforced and that there were frequent calls to remove the restrictions. Quarterly meetings were not the only place Methodists would experience love feasts. A local congregation might hold a love feast for its own members outside of the quarterly cycle. Special occasions might be marked with a love feast, in this case, for Old People's Day. District, regional, and conference denominational gatherings sometimes had a love feast, as would gatherings of preachers. Love feasts also occurred at camp meetings, extremely popular with the Methodists throughout the 19th century, and sometimes even sponsored by Methodist communities. These love feasts were principally times of testimony and prayer, with rarely a collection for the poor, mostly because special offerings were made on other occasions. Even less likely was a sharing of bread and water. Morning typically was the time for the love feast, and towards the end of the encampment or on its final day. In some camps, the Lord's Supper followed immediately or soon after the love feast. Sometimes prayer meetings came after both of them. Camp meetings took place throughout the country, not just on the frontier, as some would suppose. In some places, Methodists lifted restrictions of attendance to allow participation from persons from other Christian communities. An eyewitness from a camp meeting in Easton, Massachusetts in 1841 reported using language that echoed the experiences of Methodist love feasts from earlier times and in other contexts. A love feast was held at the stand on Sabbath morning, and a most powerful season it was. One young brother made a most happy allusion to Mr. Wesley and to the result of his extraordinary labors, a part of the fruits of which were then before us, and in which he remarked that he had visited the birthplace of that truly good and great man and had shed tears over his grave. One aged brother from Lynn remarked that he was brought to God through the instrumentality of Jesse Lee and had been a member of the society for 50 years, one of those few men who in themselves connect the history of the past with the present. One sea captain, who had been most happily converted on the ground, said that he had followed the seas for 26 years, during which time, he was ashamed to say it, he had sailed under the black flag, but he had now hoisted the white. Several Baptist and Congregational brethren also spoke, to whose pious feeling and truly evangelical sentiments the people most heartily responded. Many spoke of their great obligations to Methodism, to the instrumentality of which under God they owed the salvation of their souls. Others also spoke very feelingly of their indebtedness to the prayers and labors of pious parents. On account of the vast number who were present at this love feast, that perfect order which is desirable could not well be maintained, but it was a most delightful and refreshing occasion. In 1858, the Methodist Episcopal Church South published in their Book of Discipline an entire section devoted to the Love Feast, the first of the Methodist denominations in the United States to do so. Besides the long repeated rules about admission, frequency, at least quarterly, and duration, the discipline included a description of the ideal shape and content of the feast. After singing and prayer, the minister may make a short address, setting forth the nature and design of this institution. Everyone present shall then partake of a little bread and water in token of brotherly love, and a collection shall be taken up for the poor of the church whenever it is deemed necessary. And this is interesting. Candidates for church fellowship may then be received into the church. After which the members shall give brief details of their religious experience, and the meeting shall close with singing and prayer. With the exception of the restriction of the Love Feast to 1.5 hours and the direction for admission into the church, this information continued through the remainder of the Methodist Episcopal Church South's disciplines until the denomination merged with 2 others in 1939, and the legislation disappeared. Even though by 1938 the actual practice of love feasts had long been in decline across the majority of Methodist denominations, the 1938 discipline listed the section on the love feast under the broader heading of the means of grace, along with public worship and prayer meetings. A first such formal identification of the love feast as a means of grace in an authorized and official denominational record. The Methodist Episcopal Church South's preservation of the Love Feast legislation and the discipline had important implications for the denomination's missionary work. For example, the denomination began mission work in Korea in 1897, a dozen years after the Methodist Episcopal Church started their efforts. Missionaries from both denominations began love feasts with the Korean Christians while observing sexual segregation because of social restrictions. Because the Methodist Episcopal Church South had a written pattern for a love feast, church leaders translated that text for the Korean versions of the discipline. Korean practice conformed largely to what the missionaries knew, quarterly love feasts, and on other occasions, including Christmas Day and meetings of conference. Over time, Korean observance of the love feast declined, likely supplanted by a weekday evening testimony service, which was very popular. Within the Methodist Wesleyan family in the United States, the African Methodist Episcopal Church has most closely adhered to the polity, liturgy, and practices inherited from John Wesley. The church carefully preserved the practice of love feasts, but at the end of the 19th century gave them a new interpretation, largely because of the intervention of Bishop Henry M. Turner. Turner supplied an extended section on love feasts in a question and answer format in his book, The Genius and Theory of Methodist Polity, published in 1885 by the Denominational Press. The object of the Methodist love feast, said Turner, is to prepare the church for the Lord's Supper, to have the people bury all bickerings, malice, envy, and strife, and if any are not speaking, to get them to make up and start upon a new Christian career. So this necessitates holding the love feast before the Lord's Supper. Turner recommended holding the love feast less than a week from communion, such as a Thursday or Friday night, or if necessary, early Sunday morning. The general rules were to be read at every love feast, since John Wesley himself had ordered it, so said Turner. Bread and water were to be used, bread as a symbol of goodwill, and water of purification. Bread could be eaten after receiving it or be broken with other persons, followed by a shaking of hands. At a time when many Methodists and Wesleyans were removing their restrictions on attendance, Turner insisted that such limitations for admission be kept. Several things are interesting about this contribution by Turner. First, while confession was a part of Wesley's original definition of the content of the Love Feast, Turner nuanced that aspect to emphasize instead reconciliation with neighbor. Although he does not quote Matthew 24 regarding the settling of disputes before presenting a gift at the altar, this seems to be very much what stands behind this adopted practice. Second, Turner's scheme influenced the shape of the 1984 African Methodist Episcopal Church's Love Feast, printed in the Denominations Book of Worship. And you see here the outline of the order provided in the 1984 Book of Worship, including the reading from the general rules. Third, based on an article published in 1991 by a minister of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, Turner's adaptation was at the time a recommended practice. The article teases out more fully the protocols for the passing of the bread, which seems remarkably like James Wheatley's practice that was condemned in 1765. There are indications that even though generally the practice was disappearing, in the late 19th century, there were Methodists still who were recovering the Love Feast. In 1887, with the Christmas Day Love Feast, Phineas Breese first experienced the practice while serving as a Methodist Episcopal Church pastor in Pasadena, California. When Breese founded the Church of the Nazarene, he kept the Christmas Day Love Feast, which lacked attendance restrictions and thereby attracted large crowds, but which retained many of the common elements, such as the use of bread and water and evangelical testimony. Breese also instituted a bi-monthly practice in his congregation, alternating the Love Feast with the Lord's Supper. His example seems to have inspired the practice in other congregations and in other denominational settings, but following Breese's death, Love Feasts effectively died out among the Nazarenes. Thus, by the early 20th century, the practice of the Love Feast for most Methodists and Wesleyans in the United States was an annual event, an occasional historic reenactment, or for many, a memory of Methodism's past. We turn now to the rejuvenation of the Love Feast. In the United States in the year 1939, 3 Methodist denominations united to form a new one, the Methodist Church. One of those denominations, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, brought its order for the observance of the Love Feast, now in use for 80 years. For reasons unknown, but likely because the practice was rare and there was little interest in encouraging it, the new Methodist Church did not accept the order in its discipline. Indeed, there is no mention of Love Feast at all in the Methodist Church's 1939 discipline or in later versions. Yet 25 years later, in the publication of the denomination's second book of worship, there is a form for use in the observance of the Love Feast, located in the book section on services in the Methodist tradition. The instructions to the form provide a limited but practical perspective. They read, traditionally, worshipers were seated in a circle or around a table. Bread was broken into small portions, or a common loaf was passed from hand to hand. A loving cup with 2 handles was provided for water, but later individual glasses were used. The order itself uses a Jewish prayer of blessing, a barakah, at the passing of the bread. But for the water, Jesus is saying, whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. After the sharing of food, the form suggests a Christianized barakah for a prayer of thanksgiving, said in unison. Nowhere does the form mention a connection with the agape, but the use of the barakot silently connects the Love Feast with Jewish, and hence Jesus's, meal prayers. 6 years after the publication of the Book of Worship, An accompanying companion appeared with comments on the Love Feast by New York Methodist pastor M. Lawrence Snow, which show an intention to repurpose the historic event. His comments in full read, "Excellent as a regular part of an ecumenical Bible study group or at the end of a period of study and fellowship. Use water and buns. When bread and wine or grape juice are used, it blurs the distinction between the meal and communion. The Shalom group in Holland is doing this blurring intentionally, but it can create as many difficulties as it overcomes, especially when Roman Catholics are participating. Let the offering for the poor be sacrificial and go to some definite cause in the neighborhood. Depending on the nature and will of the group, the offering could go for anything from migrant work to legal aid for conscientious objectors." Remember, this is during the time of the Vietnam War. "If Roman Catholics are involved, try to secure the or a parish priest's participation. Let there be testimonies about what the fellowship and study mean and imply, especially popular with college-age youth. It is not a substitute for or a shortcut to the sacrament of Holy Communion. Love Feast can be effectively used as a high point in small group retreats, for example, a senior high camp. Better alternative than the overdone semi-pagan campfires," he says. On retreats, fasting or sacrificial meals could provide for the offering. Voluntary prayers, let there be silence, and sentence petitions. Snow's comments reflect some of the shifts in views already taking place regarding the Love Feast and anticipate some future directions. Within the Methodist and Wesleyan family, the 1964-65 Methodist Church Love Feast text was one of several to appear in denominational worship resources in the last 60-plus years. To examine the rejuvenated Love Feast and its emerging possibilities, we look again at the categories of purpose and practice teased out of Wesley's plain account, but now adjusted to reflect 20th and 21st century emphases revealed in these liturgical resources and documents. So, a new purpose, an imitation and perpetuation of Jesus's apostolic and or Methodist Wesleyan practices. Imitation of the apostolic agape, which motivated Wesley's appropriation of the practice, remained important in the 20th and 21st centuries, in part because of the 20th century liturgical movement and its intentional recovery of early Christian praxis as a source for the renewal and revitalization of worship. The Love Feast's antiquity, and especially its use prior to major divisions of the churches, gave it the capacity to serve in some way in the ecumenical enterprise as an opportunity for fellowship among churches unable to feast together at the Lord's table. Equally significant was the need to preserve and perpetuate, albeit in an updated approach, a vital tradition of the Methodist heritage. Many Methodists and Wesleyans recognize that in a time of declining attendance and membership, the Love Feast might fan the flames of faith and reinvigorate the churches as it had done generations ago. To these two important sources and warrants, new texts in the 21st century added a third, Jesus' own radical eating at table in fellowship with both disciple and unbeliever. Emphasis on the Love Feast as open table fellowship could address the concerns of evangelism and declining membership by welcoming the stranger or seeker. An open table fellowship at the Love Feast also could enable the preservation of the Lord's Supper as the meal of the baptized for those churches committed to such for theological and ecumenical reasons. An open and occasional event. With the exception of the formal documents of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, as far as I'm aware, Suggestions for love peace practice in the past half century have not included requirements for limiting access to the event. And in the case of the AME and AME Zion, the fencing requirements generally are not enforced in actual practice. And for some, the notion of fencing is highly offensive. This is a significant shift from the earliest Methodist practice of the Love Feast, but the natural conclusion to the slow decline in the number of restrictions expressed in the polity and practice of most denominations. The recent openness in attendance is indicative of a social evolution that in most contexts allows the free expression of all within a group, though in some places love feasts still are held specific to age, gender, and marital status because of the ease of such conversation such settings can afford. An open attendance also speaks to a basic change of purpose in the gatherings. In previous generations, persons had the capability and the willingness to speak about deeply personal matters of faith, and those conversations and testimonies form the core of the love feast. In some places, those capacities still thrive. In many Western and Anglo churches, the social expectation of a privatized faith, and often the absence of skill in expressing that faith, necessitate alternatives to the time of testimony. Acknowledging this truth, the introduction to the United Church of Canada's Forum for Love Feasts suggests an option for offering accounts of what God has been doing in the lives of individuals, the community, and the world in the third person. Instructions within an order released this year by the Methodist Church of Great Britain invite responses to God's grace and goodness and or reflections on previous parts of the service. By the beginning of the 20th century, love feasts were mostly occasional events, and among most Methodists and Wesleyans, that has remained the case to today. Love feasts are held on certain days of the church calendar: Christmas Day, New Year's Eve or Day, the weekdays of Holy Week, Pentecost, and church anniversaries. Church meetings, from small communities to large conference or synod meetings, serve often as loci for love feasts. Camp meetings and revivals may include love feasts. Increasingly, as already noted, love feasts are held for ecumenical events when shared participation in the Eucharist is not feasible, yet there is a strong desire for an expression of unity. In all these cases, it usually is made clear that the love feast is not a substitute for the Lord's Supper, but rather is a distinctly different kind of service and a standalone event. As Lawrence Snow wisely noted, it is not a substitute for or a shortcut to the sacrament of communion. A love feast with a common meal. In keeping with the spirit of charity, love feasts still usually include a collection for the poor, most often in money, but occasionally in goods. Since the 1960s, there has been interest in restoring the meal aspect of the original agape among a variety of Christian communities, including non-Wesleyans, which emphasizes real feeding with real food, thereby supplying a real meal to those with and without means. For some, this is a theological and liturgical move to correct the displacement of the agape from the Eucharist, and they have proposed that table fellowship with food should be directly connected with the sharing of the sacrament in time and space. For some, this is a social move to correct the disparity between rich and poor that St. Paul lamented regarding the Corinthian church's agape, and to ensure, in a spirit of love, that no one leaves the time of fellowship physically hungry. 3 current Methodist-related love feast orders specifically associate the love feast with more than symbolic eating, though none supplies a rationale for doing so. Instructions with the love feast order in the United Methodist Book of Worship read, "The love feast may also be followed by a full meal, in which case persons or families may bring dishes of food for all to share. During the meal, there may be informal conversation and Christian fellowship, or the leader may direct the conversation by suggesting matters of mutual concern, or there may be spontaneous witnessing and praise. If there is food left over, it may be taken as an expression of love to persons not present. The United Church of Canada order similarly suggests a post-Love Feast church supper. Alternatively, the order from the Methodist Church of Great Britain proposes that the Love Feast might follow a fairly simple supper, lunch, or tea time meal at which normal conversation has taken place. Some congregations from three denominations have gone further and adapted the practice of a full meal love feast followed by the Eucharist, either by their own innovation or as part of the growing dinner church or simple church movement, which is sometimes connected with the Fresh Expressions movement. While a dinner church format may restore the link between agape and Eucharist, it may for Methodists and Wesleyans mean the loss of the love feast as a distinctive event with a unique heritage. Confession and forgiveness leading to reconciliation. The exercise of confession and forgiveness, so important to the early Methodist love feasts following the expectations for Christian community expressed in the letter of James, was difficult if not impossible to facilitate in gatherings larger than the small group bands and class meetings. Over time, this aspect of the love feast declined substantially, but was not lost altogether, dependent upon the setting, size, and intent of the event. As we have seen, the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches redefined the emphasis on confession and forgiveness by focusing instead on reconciliation of differences preparatory to receiving the Lord's Supper. Love feasts suited well the purpose of general reconciliation, reconciliation between church members, or in the case of ecumenical events, facilitating the possibility of steps in the process toward reconciliation of division to bring about the unity of the church for which Jesus prayed. Most recently, individual pastors and church leaders have used love feasts as instruments to open up God's healing of relationships within families, neighborhoods, and communities, and even across borders. An example of the latter took place at the United States and Mexican border, as reported by Jamie Gates. He wrote, "On June 1st, 2008, Methodist minister Reverend John Fanistil and I, a minister in the Church of the Nazarene, led a binational prayer vigil and a love feast at Friendship Park. We plan to share a love feast rather than enter into the complicated liturgical issues of how to share communion with the spectacularly ecumenical crowd that turns out for our border gatherings. A love feast is a simple meal shared in a spirit of humility and peace that Christ is present in our lives. Although mostly practiced among the faithful, the love feast often extended to all who gathered as a witness to the love found in Jesus. Early Methodists and Nazarenes embraced this tradition, and it was out of these deep roots that we shared sweet bread and tamarindo juice in prayer and Christian solidarity. At this time of social unrest in the United States, England, and around the world, might the love feast be a gift from the Methodist and Wesleyan tradition to neighborhoods and wider communities where people of faith might gather for worship and to listen to each other and to the voice of God? A prudential means of grace. In its capacity to aid in reconciliation and healing, increase faith and strengthen in love, and motivate persons to engage in every good work, the love feast, even in the 21st century, can serve once again as a prudential means of grace. Orders of service supplied by several churches introduce new generations to what the love feast may offer, providing a shape and a structure connected with the past and flexible enough to be of benefit to the present and future. And here you can see the structures of 3 services. Here, the United Methodist Book of Worship, If you scan your eye quickly, you will see that there are many similarities with this 1964 order that was provided in the Methodist Church. There are also similarities with Frank Baker's reconstruction. And the same is true here for the United Church of Canada's order in Celebrate God's Presence. And notice that the response is maybe not testimonies, but certainly reflections on readings and other kinds of possibilities. And in the proposed order from this year, which was sent out relative to the COVID crisis, an order that looks fairly similar to what Frank Baker reconstructed from the early Methodist resources. As these orders attest, many of the components of the love feast cherished by Wesley and the early Methodists have withstood the passage of time. Prayer, singing, the reading of scripture, spoken responses to God's work among individuals and in the world, eating together to build up the community, caring for the needy through a collection of money. But as a prudential means of grace, what is done in the love feast should be that which best allows God's gifts to be perceived and received at a particular place and time. John Wesley was wise in not providing or prescribing a particular text for the love feast. Indeed, as these three churches with formal texts make clear, these orders of service are guides, not requirements. So you may have been wondering all this time what I said to my former student who emailed me asking about a Maundy Thursday love feast. Would prayer, persons eating in their respective places, and a simple sharing of joys, sorrows, and frustrations constitute a love feast? Could she claim her proposed Maundy Thursday practice to be a part of the Wesleyan tradition? I believe our look at the love feast from its institution to its emerging possibilities has made my answer clear. My answer, yes to both. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very stimulating, graciously handled. Thank you, everybody who's managed to rejoin. I realize that some people will no doubt end up watching this on the edited version on YouTube. But again, our apologies for the interruption, and we will make the necessary reports, of course. I realize that some of you will have questions, and Peter Ray suggested that participants raise their hands in order to ask a question, and we will attempt to moderate down the side. Now, because of our interruption, we probably have about 20 minutes for questions, if that's all right, as long as that's all right with you, Professor Westerfield Tucker. Okay, lovely. And so if there are any questions, then do flag up by raising your hands along the side. I'm scanning the side. Peter, are you also looking? Because I'm pretty rubbish at these scanning things.
I see Wendy Molasaib has her hand raised. I could just say that if you'd use the electronic hand waving, which is under the participants tag,
oh,
you
yeah.
see your hand a little more easily under the participants tag. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sorry, I wasn't clear. I have 3 screens, so I'm not seeing people visually. Wendy, would you like to go ahead and ask your question, please?
Sure. I am curious regarding the shift out of away from confession, and thinking about the band meeting being a place where confessional experiences happened. The class meeting was also a space where testimony and confession could happen. And then the love feast, and just thinking of the combination of confession shifting and its shift in our current United Methodist set. I'm also a United Methodist pastor, so in our United Methodist settings, I just wonder if, as you've studied this and thought about this, what do you see as a loss or a gain? I mean, you alluded to some of that in terms of the welcoming of other people into the community, but I wonder the loss of confession in that much of our heritage. What observations or thoughts you might have regarding that?
I think in terms of the love feast, I think the shift away from the love feast came about in part because of the formalization of worship practices that grew during the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century, that as orders of worship became available, which included confession, most often in conjunction with the celebration of the Lord's Supper, there was automatically a forum for that within church structures, coupled with the fact, as you mentioned, that the loss of intimacy of the small group did not allow that practice to continue. I think to answer your question about contemporary practice, I think part of the concern about confession is because in many places in the Christian communities, there's a greater sense of, shall I call it, human positivism. In fact, one can track, in looking at the history of the United States, which I honestly know better than the history in Britain, but I suspect it's similar, that there is a movement away from an understanding of original sin. You can track it in multiple ways in the history of Methodism in the United States, in different branches of Methodism. One place that's particularly interesting, I, as somebody who works in the area of liturgy, find it in the evolving rites related to baptism, because early on the assumption is original sin is operative in the need for baptism. Even with children. By the early 20th century, you find in the Methodist Episcopal Church a modified baptismal text, which basically speaks of the original innocence of children. There's no longer the language of original sin. I would say by and large, the language of sin is toned down in many churches today, simply because it's not popular. It's hard to welcome people and be friendly and receptive if you're condemning them as sinners. I think that's unfortunate for multiple reasons, theological as well as pastoral and practical. But I think that's a reality that has happened over time. So that's a good question, Wendy. That's something I struggle with as a pastor and a teacher of worship, what to say about the issue of confession in worship, not just in conjunction with the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, and not just during times of Lent, but at other times as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then Howard Schneider is here. Howard, you have a question as well. Would you like to ask?
Yeah, one of the things that I find most dynamic about Methodism is the way Wesley was both inclusive and exclusive. The inclusiveness, but structures for exclusiveness in the sense of exactly what you're saying, the band, confidentiality, James 5:16, and so on. It seems to me that in your very good presentation, I appreciate it very much, that you see that tension all the way through, in the different forms. There was the tension between the inclusive and exclusive, and it seems Wesley intended it to be a part of an ecology, obviously, of the, as you were mentioning, of the bands and the societies and so on, and all within the context of the Church of England. I wonder if you had any comments just on that sort of exclusive, inclusive aspect when we consider the bands in connection with the larger total church life.
Well, I'm thinking in terms of the Love Feast. I think the Love Feast transition is very notable, from the exclusive to a more inclusive approach. And what I find particularly interesting in the American setting is the Love Feast, at least in its early offerings from the end of the 18th century through most of the 19th century, the Love Feast was actually the more exclusive of the practices relative to the celebration of the Eucharist. That the Eucharist, in some sense, had a wider expectation of attendance than the Love Feast because of the intimacy that was expected to be revealed there. So in terms of the bands, you know, I don't know enough about the history of the bands and the development of the bands to get to enter into that fully. But I would say in terms of the practices related to Love Feast and Eucharist, it's clear that in the cases of both Eucharist and Love Feast over time, there has been a shift away from an exclusive approach to a more broadly inclusive approach. Many folks forget that the ticket for admission was required not only for the Love Feast, but also for the Eucharist. And over time, both of those things have disappeared.
Thank you. Tim has a question or a comment, I believe.
Hello, Tim.
Hello. Hello, Karen. Thank you for a splendid lecture. I thought it was very interesting that you quoted Joseph Nightingale and the Portraiture of Methodism, 1807, the same year that primitive Methodism was born on Mount Cop here in Britain. And I just wonder to what extent the use of the Love Feast became something over and against the Wesleyans, who clearly shied away from it because of the revivalist element, because of the evangelistic element of the Love Feast. In the same sense that Wesleyan Methodists started to shy away from the sacrament of Holy Communion when the Oxford movement got hold of it and made it a much more frequent sacrament. And I just wonder also if the Love Feast isn't a way of freeing people from clericalism within the church and to reclaim the liturgy as a work of the people, particularly with the emphasis on testimonies. And maybe that is something which appeals to the contemporary church. I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, you've got a lot going there, Tim. I think one of the things that's really interesting, and this became very evident in my study of this subject, which I wasn't able to get into as much as I would have liked because of the limitations on library access because of the COVID crisis. But the American situation and the British situation were very different in this, and that the Love Feast in the American situation after the establishment of the Methodist Episcopal Church, in some sense, becomes very clericalized because it is run by preachers, heads of circuit, then preachers in circuit, and then by the presiding elder, who is effectively, to use language now, a district superintendent who would have oversight of several pastors. So the British situation, I think, is a little bit different here, that it became more of John Walsh calls it a quasi-sacramental quasi-sacramental folk event, whereas in the United States, it has a different status because of its restrictions in terms of presidency. But people have shied away from the Love Feast in American practice, as you rightly describe in British practices, because it can get out of hand. It can become very emotional, and as Methodisms desire to become more respectable, the Wesleyan Methodists, as well as the Methodist Episcopal Church and some other churches, they didn't want to go that direction any longer because they wanted to enter kind of the religious mainstream. We often say in terms of the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States, they wanted to look like the Episcopal Church, which was the church of means, and the church of status. So that, I think, had a lot to do with the demise of the Love Feast because of its evangelistic and charismatic qualities. But for many, that was precisely its charm. And so in the United States, and I suspect in Britain, it stays alive mostly in the form of annual camp meetings, where its practice can be highly variable depending on the imagination of the leadership.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. We have one last question, and Sarah, over to you, Sarah Dirk.
Hi, Sarah.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for your wonderful paper. I am wondering if you have any evidence of manifestations of the love feast in contemporary practice that maintain the gender segregation, excuse me. I am not typically inclined to participate in, quote, women's ministry events at my local church, but if it were to be a love feast where I could count on actual confession and a collection for the poor and testimony, etc., I might be more willing to join in that. So I'm just wondering if in any of the, for instance, the 3 orders that you presented from contemporary church bodies, do you see any evidence of the gender segregation being maintained at all?
Not in those church orders, but anecdotally, I know that is the case, that there are particularly women's fellowships that will use this as a time to go more deeply in spiritual conversations in a safe place, with kind of a code of conduct established from the beginning that, you know, this is confidential, what's spoken here does not leave the room. And even though it may not have the sharing of foodstuffs or a collection of the poor, the focus is on that confessional and deeply religious focus of the event as it would have been seen, say, in the 18th century. But that's mostly anecdotal. I haven't seen anything written up about it. I just know from people who have had pastors who have interest in starting love feasts in communities that this is kind of the way they have gone about it. Knowing in many churches, at least in my own United Methodist tradition, that women are often more willing to experiment on these things than maybe men are. And that women are often crying for a place where they can go deep with their feelings and their spiritual concerns. So as I've been working on this project, it struck me that this is a much larger project than I had imagined, simply because of the possibility of doing anecdotal analysis, what's actually happening out there in real places with real people. But I do think I have argued all along, first as a pastor and now as a teacher of worship, that the love feast is probably the most underserved of our components of our heritage, that because it is so flexible, can very easily be adapted to new situations and used to good purpose. You know, back in the day when we were concerned about seeker services taking over the ordinary Sunday morning service, you know, my suggestion was that the love feast could do that purpose. I mean, some of us remember the Sunday evening evangelistic meetings, and in some sense, the love feast could do that. Of course, the love feast was held in the evening, so it's no surprise that those evangelistic services probably morphed out of the evening love feasts in many places. So I think it has great possibilities for use, especially in terms of its ecumenical possibilities. I'm very much interested in that, but also being very cautious about the fact that it can't be seen as a communion light or a substitute for communion. It is something, you know, completely different. And in the time of online worship, many churches have now been looking at the love feast, recognizing and being very careful to say this is not communion that you can do on your own at home, but this is something within our heritage that we can share together and use as a time for speaking of experiences in the faith. And from congregations that have adopted, I have a lot of love feast, examples of love feast services that have been done online, that this has been a rich resource for people during the time of church closures.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, it just falls to me to say thank you so much. What a wonderful lecture. We're again so sorry for its interruption, and we know that it was so gracious of you to pick it up seamlessly as you did, and so thank you so much for mastering that as well. For those of you who are PhD students, our residency non-residential continues tomorrow at 3 p.m. And then we have a lecture next week with Professor David Clough from the University of Chester.
Mm-hmm.
And that's on Wednesday, the 24th at 7:30 BST. And it's called Consuming Creatures, the Christian Ethics of Eating Animals. So that should be quite thought-provoking as well. So all of that is available on the website. But again, thank you so much for taking the time today. And God be with you in your endeavors as we go. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.